Hello there everyone, my name is Luke and today we will be talking about the tutorial sections of the first 3 Dark Souls games. This video is a follow-up to my previous video which was a more straightforward commentary of the opening sections of those games. Watching the first video isn't required to understand this one, but I think it will help to understand where I'm coming from with my comments. I'm going to be looking a little deeper at how each tutorial section works and discussing how they relate to the rest of their respective games. Before we go any further, and because I seem to enjoy making caveats at the beginning of my videos, a quick note about my decision to draw the line between tutorials, introductions and the rest of the game for each of the games we will be talking about. I will give my reasoning for each, but I am aware that there will be disagreement. I might speak with an authoritative tone, but everything that I put in my videos is based on my own subjective opinion. At no point do I claim that anything I say is objective fact. All of my observations are based on my own thoughts and I welcome criticism of them because it makes me a better critic myself. With that disclaimer being made, let's get started. Tutorials are an important yet often overlooked part of the design of video games. They are the first areas that players will engage with and as such often have to do a lot of things at once in order to bring the player into the world. Mechanics, enemy types, plot points and backstory all need to be introduced and reinforced often at the same time and ideally in a way that feels natural within the context of the game world itself. A first-person shooter might situate its tutorial section within a boot camp setting, meaning that the game can speak directly to you through the mouth of an NPC character, perhaps a sergeant, who is drilling his new recruits, the player character being one of them. The player might be taught how to crouch under things, jump over things, switch weapons, throw grenades, etc., but that is usually the extent of the mechanical information that players are given. The fourth wall is being broken, but it feels natural within the setting. A real-time strategy game, however, would have to tutorialise its mechanics in a different way, more than likely using on-screen prompts and finding different ways of speaking to the player without necessarily breaking them out of their immersion within the game by shouting instructions at them. Games in certain genres may have to take more or less time to explain themselves to players simply by virtue of how universally accepted their mechanics are. An FPS like Half-Life or Wolfenstein has the benefit of mechanics that might be more broadly understood by the player because in 2019 we have been living through almost 30 years of FPS design evolution and as such are probably familiar with similar games in the genre. We don't really need tutorial sections in these games because we already know how to play them. An RTS game such as the Total War franchise might take longer to tutorialise its mechanics simply because there is more to explain. The discussion of tutorials and introductions gets more complicated once you start comparing how they are handled between genres, so we won't pursue this line of discussion any further at this point. It is enough at this point to point out that different genres have to take more or less time to explain themselves to the player, and for a variety of reasons. The Dark Souls games are neither FPS games nor RTS games. Wikipedia calls the first Dark Souls game an action role-playing game, which is funny because for myself I don't see many role-playing options in the Souls games. I think it's more accurate to describe the Souls games as operating within their own genre. They may share third-person combat mechanics with, say, DMC or The Witcher, but the comparisons don't go much further than that. The result is that the Souls games have to work much harder to bring the player into their worlds and teach them how those worlds work. The tutorial sections of these games therefore have to do a lot more heavy lifting than other games in order to explain things to the player. What can be difficult to understand, particularly in the case of the Souls games, is where the tutorial sections end, because Dark Souls as a series doesn't stop teaching the player new things, not really, and the player is constantly learning new things as they play through the game. Let's take the Taurus Demon boss fight as an example. Going through the fog door and onto the ramparts forever cements in the player's mind the association of bosses with these doors. About a third of the way across you are hit in the back with an arrow. You turn and see 2 archers on top of the tower behind you. You move back toward them, spying a ladder just to the left of the door you've come through. You climb it and dispatch 2 enemies. You return to the ramparts and resume your journey across. About halfway along, the Taurus Demon leaps from the tower ahead. What the game is testing at this point is your ability to draw the link between the ladder you just climbed to defeat the 2 archer enemies and the way that you defeated the Asylum Demon in the Undead Asylum. Though it is definitely possible to defeat the Taurus Demon by running between his legs and dodging his attacks, the game is actually expecting new players to bait him into position where they can perform a plunging attack. The damage that players can inflict through normal attacks at this point is probably so low that they are nudged into repeating the process of plunge attacking in order to be victorious. The demon brings the player full circle back to the Asylum Demon and the lessons that he imparted to the player. It is for this reason that I argue that the tutorial section of Dark Souls 1 ends with the Asylum Demon. For the player to have beaten the Taurus Demon requires the ability to apply previously acquired knowledge to different situations, and players prove this by defeating the Taurus Demon. It comes back to what I said earlier about the Souls tutorials giving the player all the tools that they need to beat the rest of the game. You can see a similar test of what the player has learned in Dark Souls 3. There is no trick to the Iodex Gundyr fight, it's a straight test of the combat skills the player has learned in the admirably brief section beforehand. Gundyr's moves are quick but well telegraphed, giving the player plenty of time to prepare a dodge. Gundyr also has a side shunt move that punishes players trying to circle strafe, a move that is a very easy trick to use on enemies throughout the Souls series. His moveset rewards dodging blows rather than trying to block them, forcing players to learn how to time dodges. The reinforcement of the lessons Gundyr teaches is when the player fights Vort of the Boreal Valley, or Dancer of the Boreal Valley if new players have a death wish. Both are defeated by timing dodges and making good use of the space of the boss arena. Dark Souls 2 is the odd one out of the three because in terms of bosses teaching and reinforcing lessons to the player, it doesn't have one of those. The Things Betwixt doesn't even have a boss at all unless you count the mole monsters as bosses. It's a long time before players come across a boss at all, and depending on which direction players take, it could be either the Last Giant, or the Pursuer, or the Old Dragon Slayer, or the Dragon Rider, or the Royal Rat Vanguard, and I think you can see the point that I'm trying to make. I think the Last Giant is meant to be the first boss based purely on his moveset and how well telegraphed his attacks are, but the game is designed so that players have at least 3 directions they can head in once they reach Majula, so it's difficult to say for sure. Others have pointed out that the branching nature of Dark Souls 2 means that the difficulty level of all of the bosses I've just mentioned is pretty much the same, and while I agree, I'd argue that this is a deliberate choice made in deference to new players rather than something accidental and an oversight on From's part. I think I'm still justified in saying that the tutorial section ends when the player emerges into the light of Majula because of the thematic pause for breath that it offers after the very mechanic-heavy tutorializing of the Things Betwixt. The move from the darkness into the welcoming warmth of Majula is a metaphorical rebirth. The tinkling music in the background combined with the gentle crash of the waves far below is a relaxing shift in tone from every other area in the game. For the player, Majula is home. Maybe the hardest thing to get your head around when you are talking about tutorials is the idea that everything is placed very carefully and usually for a very good reason. When you've been playing the Souls games for tens of hours, it can be very difficult to look beyond just accepting things for what they are. When you are starting Dark Souls 1 for the umpteenth time and running down your first corridor next to the Stray Demon, it can be very easy to forget that all those hollows were placed in that corridor for a reason, because you are probably sprinting past them to get to the Asylum Demon and the rest of the game. You have to look at everything as if it's the first time you are seeing it as a player, and from a developer's point of view, you can't afford to assume that the players played video games before, because not everyone who boots your games has been playing games all their lives. If the 99th person out of 100 has never played a video game before and they can't engage with your game because you haven't tutorialized it properly, you've failed as a designer. I might get some flack for saying that, I can practically see the comments about casuals already, but games are for everyone, not just the hardcore. Developers need to be able to communicate at every level if they want as many people to be able to engage with and have fun with their game. So what is the first thing that the Dark Souls games usually communicate to players within gameplay? I specify within gameplay because I don't want to get too bogged down with Dark Souls lore and the cutscenes that open the 3 games at this point. I want to talk about the first things that the player can do when they assume control on a Dark Souls game. Well, in each game the player is given a relatively open, stress-free space in which they probably press all the buttons and work out what they all do. Console players will probably work out how to attack, block, how the inventory works, etc. quicker than PC players because there are fewer buttons to try out, and because From are terrible at porting their games for PC. And it is this fact that brings me to my first point of comparison of each of the tutorial sections in the 3 games. While it is fair to say that most players will quickly get to grips with the controls in each of the 3 Souls games, the first encounter with an enemy is completely different between the games. In Dark Souls 1, the first enemy you meet is an unarmed hollow, probably cowering against a wall. He doesn't attack you ever and goes down within maybe 3 or 4 hits from your broken weapon. In Dark Souls 2, I will go out on the line here and say that almost all players' first encounter will be with the mole monster. At this point, the player has no weapon, but we are talking about Dark Souls fans here, so undoubtedly they will charge in fists flying. You will get eaten, as the grab attack on these guys is damn near instant. In Dark Souls 3, the first enemy will attack and is quite aggressive, but the player almost certainly will put him down with one stroke. All 3 encounters function in broadly similar ways, and they provide a target that the player uses to practice on so that they can learn how quick their attacks move, how their player moves, etc. But I think that the mole monster encounter in Dark Souls 2 has the additional role of being a prank that the game plays on returning players to the series, but one that punishes new players as well. It's what Joseph Anderson refers to as a gotcha enemy, and one that I think is pretty cheap in what is ultimately an introductory section to a game. While we're talking about the mole monster, it's a good point to talk about how the Dark Souls games teach the player about death. Death is inevitable, it happens a lot, it will happen to you, but crucially death isn't really failure per se. Each of the Dark Souls games has an enemy that teaches player that death will happen, but each of these enemies pull double duty in teaching other lessons as well. Dark Souls 2 is the mole monster. After being eaten the first time, the players return to the ruined temple and the things betwixt, but because of the snappy grab attacks, players might not have been able to even land a hit on the monster before being eaten, and go back for round 2 not realising that they are just not strong enough to take on this enemy yet. The other two games have their own equivalents. Dark Souls 1 has the Asylum Demon, Dark Souls 3 is the Ravenous Crystal Lizard, and both of these enemies are much better examples of teaching moments. The player has an opportunity to land at least a few hits on each before realising that they probably aren't going to be victorious this time before being munched to death. Immediately the player is thinking of alternative strategies to progress, and in the case of all three, the way forward is to find an alternative route and come back later. In the Undead Asylum, the player gets a better weapon and loops round for round 2 with the Asylum Demon. In Dark Souls 3, the player likely takes a much larger loop round before they face the Ravenous Lizard again, many hours after first encountering it. Dark Souls 2 fudges the teaching moment by trying to be cute and tricking Dark Souls 1 players. The point about what I will call the death moments and teaching the idea that coming back to fight another day is often a good strategy leads on to a broader comment I wanted to make about the relationship between the level design of the tutorial areas themselves and the rest of their respective games. Broadly speaking, the design of the Undead Asylum, Things Betwixt and the Cemetery of Ash are microcosms of the broader level design philosophy of the games that they tutorialise. The Undead Asylum is tight and vertical with an emphasis on closed-in space, design choices that are mirrored in the Undead Burg, Undead Parish, Sen's Fortress, The Depths, Blighttown, Duke's Archives and Anor Londo. The Things Betwixt is sprawling and linear, spread more horizontally than vertically, with more of an emphasis on open spaces, and this is reflected in the design of Heidi's Tower, Huntsman's Copse, Harvest Valley, Earthen Peak, Shaded Woods, Dragon Eyrie and Dragon Shrine. The Cemetery of Ash is as sprawling and horizontal as the Things Betwixt, but not as linear, with paths that crisscross the environment but ultimately converge at the entrance to Iredex Gundir's arena before branching out and writhing around about the entrance to Firelink Shrine. The High Wall of Lothric, Undead Settlement, Road of Sacrifices, Farron Keep and Irithyll of the Boreal Valley are all examples of the design philosophy of the Cemetery of Ash being applied throughout the rest of Dark Souls 3. Darkroot Garden, Darkroot Basin and Crystal Cave are more open horizontal areas that I think are a welcome break from the stone towers and battlements that are ubiquitous in Dark Souls 1. No Man's Wharf and the Lost Bastille in Dark Souls 2 are much more claustrophobic and with a greater verticality than a lot of levels in the game, and the Irithyll Dungeon and Profaned Capital in Dark Souls 3 are perhaps the most linear and constricted levels in the entire series. These are exceptions, however, and inevitable ones that are required to keep players engaged and interested. The point I'm trying to make here is that each of the tutorial sections is essentially the entire game boiled down into one area. Each gives the player the tools with which they can navigate any of the spaces they are presented with as they go along. Opening the gate after talking to the knight in the Undead Asylum teaches the player that they will be able to unlock shortcuts to bonfires throughout the game, a lesson that isn't explicitly taught at all in either Dark Souls 2 or 3 until quite a bit later. But neither of those games place nearly as much emphasis on tight level design as Dark Souls 1, at least the first half of that game. The Things Betwixt is pretty much one path from the ruined temple to Majula, with paths that branch off it that quickly return, teaching players that they don't need to worry about getting lost because the level design will bring them back round to where they need to be going eventually anyway. While I believe that the tutorial areas in each of the games succeed within the context of the games they're introducing, this doesn't necessarily mean that I think that they're equally as efficient at communicating their ideas to the player when compared directly. The Undead Asylum tutorial area is much more successful at what it does in half of the space and a fraction of the game time than the Things Betwixt, not only for the reason that I've spoken about earlier. There is an elephant in the room that needs addressing here, and it's the fact that Dark Souls 2 and 3 are sequels. They have the problem of being required to spin two plates at once. Where Dark Souls only had to worry about introducing new players, Dark Souls 2 and 3 have to introduce new players as well as returning players. They have to engage one set while educating the other. Dark Souls 2 does this by spreading the tutorial area out horizontally, meaning that returning players can just run through it and out the other side instead of being required to engage with it, as in Dark Souls 1. This design choice allows for greater variance in the visuals as well, beginning in the clearing of the Things Betwixt, moving up to the Witch's Hut through the maze-like area beyond before opening out into Majula. Stretching the tutorial area in this way means that you have to put stuff into it, and I have a theory here. The Things Betwixt is separated into two broad halves, the areas before and after the Witch's Hut. I think that the first area in the Witch's Hut is the tutorial for returning players, a thematic introduction more than a mechanical one, while the Witch's Hut in the area beyond is the tutorial for new players, placing more emphasis on mechanics than creating a mood. Both sets of players have to play through both areas though. Sure, the design of the area beyond the Witch's Hut means that returning players can sprint straight past all the tutorial areas and straight into Medulla, but we are talking about Dark Souls players here, the sort of people who will create entire wikis based on tiny morsels of information in item descriptions in obscure menus. These are the people who can work out that a random item picked up in one part of the world can be used to access a hidden area in a completely different part of the world. There's almost no way that any returning Souls player will skip this area for fear of missing out on sweet loot. It's kind of incredible to me then that From so clearly built in essentially 2 tutorial areas and forced players to play through both of them. What is even more incredible to me that given the lightness of touch applied to the lessons of the Undead Asylum, From chose to hit players over the head with the rulebook and the things betwixt. Let's go back to those pins I talked about in the first video. Remember them? It's time to take them down from the corkboard, and what I'm going to say here is linked very closely to my idea that the things betwixt tutorial areas split deliberately in 2 by From and designed for both returning and new players in the order that they move through it. While the area running up to the Witch's Hut is for returning players, it still imparts lessons that new players learn as well. They learn how the camera works, how to run, roll, sprint, attack, how death works, and how to lock on using the undead dogs running about as practice. In terms of the game's level design, they are shown that the way forward is ahead, that paths will branch and then converge, that items will be both hidden and displayed to the player, requiring exploration to find them all. And then after the Witch's Hut, players are shown all of these things again, using messages on stone tablets that make thematic and story sense in terms of their existence inside an area that people have passed through hundreds and hundreds of times, but in terms of gameplay are both repetitive and in some cases I highlighted in the previous video oddly misplaced. The targeting tutorial doesn't give the player multiple enemies to practice on. The backstab stone is probably too close to the enemy you're supposed to practice on, but this one is probably a nitpick. The camera control tutorial slab is placed about halfway through the second half of the things betwixt, and I don't know how to respond to this one. Did From not expect the player to have worked this one out until then? The jumping attack slab is in an area full of enemies, and because of where it is placed it's probably read after you have killed everything that you could have practiced it on. You might think that I'm being hard on the game here, players can always choose to ignore those stone tablets, but From still put them there intending them to be read. It feels like the first area of the things betwixt before the Witch's Hut was put into the game much later in development as an afterthought almost, that helpfully linked up the opening cinematic to the character creation screen. It reveals a sloppiness in design that is really obvious when compared to the tight efficiency of the tutorializing in Dark Souls 1 and 3. The stone tablets may well make more sense thematically when put against the glowing orange writing in the Undead Asylum and Cemetery of Ash, but they also mean that the developers can be lazier in the level design of the tutorial sections themselves. The stone tablets tell the player what to do, while the more easily ignorable orange writing mean the developers have to rely more heavily on the level design of the Undead Asylum and Cemetery of Ash to subtly suggest to players things that they can do. Dark Souls 2 makes the player read something and then presents them an enemy. Dark Souls 1 and 3 show the player an enemy and leave them to it. They can read the message on the floor or not. The difference between the tablets and the glowing orange writing is that the tablets exist within the world diegetically, while the orange writing exists outside the world on a level between the player and the game itself. Dark Souls 1 and 3 know their player. Dark Souls 2 doesn't trust its players, and the ultimate manifestation of this is the fact that the game makes players learn lessons twice in the things betwixt. I've focused a lot on the mechanical tutorializing the Dark Souls games, while I haven't really spoken about how the games introduce story and themes in these same areas. I made a joke in the previous video about how over the top and cliche the opening cinematics of these games are, and while I stand by that comment, I do think that they are a deliberate choice made by From, and I do think that one of the witches in the things betwixt says it best. You'll lose your souls, all of them, over and over again. The old deer with the spinning wheel in the opening cinematic to that game even says that nothing will have meaning and you won't even care. The player is told repeatedly that they will fail, but that it won't really matter. Nothing really matters, the game isn't to be taken seriously and looked too hard into, just go and enjoy it. Bloodborne is even more explicit with this message to the player, and I think the cinematics at the beginning of each of the 3 games we're looking at here only reinforces this, because they are just too bombastic and knowing to be taken as any serious contextualizing the world the player is going to be exploring. The nods and winks are too obvious to be anything other than a joke. Watching these cinematics back is like looking at a visual representation of a tag cloud drawn from a fantasy trope page. This is even without talking about the vagueness of the narration itself, how it reads like a thesaurus turned upside down with random ominous sounding words falling out and onto the writer's keyboard. The opening cinematics of the Souls games are there to set a mood rather than provide any concrete reason for why the player is fighting and why they should care. People might disagree with me here and point to the acres of lore that exists on the internet talking about Solaire or Yol of Londor, but, and forgive me for being literal here, none of this is explained explicitly in-game. It is all information that is referred to or inferred by players and expounded upon for the internet. The mood setting of these cinematics extends in Dark Souls 1 and 3 to a teasing of some of the enemies the player can look forward to encountering later on in the game. They function like the cold opening of a Bond movie, a shot of adrenaline, excitement and spectacle that is a taste of what is to come. And this brings me back finally to what I said earlier about the tutorial areas giving the player all the tools they need to beat the rest of the game. The Dark Souls tutorials teach the player to fail and how to go about achieving victory. It might be easier said than done, but from the Lowliest Hollow to Gwyn, Vendrick and the Lord of Cinder, the path to defeating these enemies begin in the Undead Asylum, Things Betwixt and Cemetery of Ash. Thanks for watching. Hi guys, thanks for taking the time to watch the second and last video in this series that I've done about the tutorial sections in the Dark Souls games. I hope you enjoyed it. I definitely enjoyed writing it and recording it and everything that comes along with it. A lot of the feedback that I've been getting about the videos themselves have been kind of based around the length of the video, so I think in future I'm going to be trying to make a few more kind of shorter ones that are a little bit more manageable, as well as at the same time kind of trying to intersperse longer, more detailed, in-depth videos as well. So again, thank you very much for watching. Please like, rate and subscribe, and I'll be back in a couple of weeks with the next video, probably about the despawning enemies, the despawning enemy choice that was made in the design of Dark Souls 2. So again, thank you very much for your time, and I'll see you next time.